Quite often, guys will ask the question, what the fuck am I doing?
I know he wants to leave his job. He shows up every day because of the gratification that he gets.
So I think that what may happen in those types of very dopamine stimulated jobs, that people begin to burn out because there are cultures like the one you've just described, where a manager will say to two people, I'm sorry, but you can't share a moment of joy. That's fucking ridiculous.
If you are pushing that hard and you get those level of rewards at that rate, at some point, something's going to shift. Probably.
That's the point that I reach, which is like, what is the point? And what might different look like?
I think there is a point where we start to realize I'm not immortal. And I think something inevitable starts to shift. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden we can go, oh, fuck it, I'm going to change my career and do something completely different.
I work with a lot of men to help them envision what their highest dream could be. And it is rarely the job that they're in. It is very often not even adjacent.
If we can invest in our health and well-being, it is perhaps the best return that we're likely to get.
I call this period somewhere between 50 and 60 Sniper's Alley. The idea being that someone or something, life, is taking pot shots at you. It is also true that you could drink every day, smoke every day, eat utter shit, and fly through this period of time. Pod 13.
Here we are.
Lucky for some.
Yeah. Work.
That's thrown me. I don't think of this as work. We're going to talk today about fulfilment, meaning, contentment, satisfaction, gratification. So beyond the financial benefit of work,
Yeah.
what are we achieving with it? What are we gaining from it? What's the purpose of it? And I think that we will relate that to midlife careers. Where do we begin, Karl?
So we've done, and if you haven't checked these out, this is the third episode in a series that we've been looking at work relationships. We did identity to begin with. We spoke about our what it means to work and how that relates to us. The last podcast, we looked at relationships within the workplace as well. We gave some examples from being a solo self-employed person to working in a huge organization, and the richness and the opportunities or the threats that might come around from relationships as well.
Yeah, I guess this is more about what's the point above and beyond the financial transaction and clearly the importance of making a living. This speaks to how does it make us feel and what purpose does that serve? And therefore, perhaps what happens in this sort of this liminality or hiatus where quite often guys will ask the question like, what the fuck am I doing? So let's begin to perhaps put down some framework for that. We before we started, we explored the difference between satisfaction and gratification, didn't we?
Yeah.
Tell me about short-term gratification.
So gratification might be a bit more of a dopamine type response. It might be satisfying a need or a thirst, a desire, a hunger for something. So often it is something that happens immediately. That gives us that sense of gratification. Satisfaction is something that is over a much longer period of time, perhaps something that we have to attain or work towards. But the idea is it resonates with us on a deeper level. We get more emotional fulfillment and nourishment, supposedly, from something that is satisfying. Gratification might be more of a mental hit. If we were to break it and simplify it, it's more complex than that. But if we were to break it into those two components.
Okay. I'm thinking of South Park and a piece of, I think it was Alan Watts' philosophy, that if people want to search for it, was called Prickles and Goo. Mm-hmm. And that was actually related to people's personality types. But in a sense, that's also this, that we've got this quite spiky stuff that fires us both physically as a dopamine reaction, the pleasure principle, which could be quite short term, but nevertheless still quite pleasurable. And then the goo, which is this more long-term satisfaction and feeling of fulfillment. So do you think it's possible in work to feel gratification but not satisfaction?
Yeah, so we spoke about this a little bit as well. What's the South Park reference? I get the Alan Watt reference.
Oh, okay. South Park's took a piece of Alan Watts's talking, I think it was Alan Watts, talking about different types of people.
Yeah.
Squiggles. No, not squiggles. Prickles.
Yeah.
And goo. Some people are prickly and all spiky, sharp-edged and quite pointy. And some people are much more water-based and softer and perhaps a little bit more roundy, edgy. And they're quite different to one another, but really, societally, we need both. What I'm using that as a visual metaphor for these spikes of desire and the buzz with this long-term, sort of more gentle, episodic or year-on-year feeling. So I'm just using it as a visual reference. They're quite different types of outcome, aren't they?
Gotcha. You mean South Park is in the cartoon, the Canadian cartoon?
That lot. Yeah. So they made this incredible piece of animation, which people can search for. It's on YouTube.
Is Cartman more spiky or more squiggly? Soft?
No
rounded?
idea.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
No idea. But let's go, in the world of work, possible to be both gratified and satisfied?
I think, yeah, the original, can we be gratified but not necessarily have
Yeah,
the
that was the original
satisfaction?
question.
Yeah. We spoke about sales. I've got a patient of mine, so I work in chronic pain, and I think part of, not the sole contributing factor, but part of this patient's presentation of why his pain can peak at certain times, why he can feel quite overwhelmed by the symptoms. In helping my patients, I need to understand more than their pelvic floor. So I work with male pelvic pain. I look at lifestyle factors, I look at family dynamics, I look at stress and sleep and multiple factors. This patient, for want of a better phrase, hates his job. The work environment's not great, it's not very supportive, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. The offices are pretty shoddy. It's a sales job, and so he has to cold call people, which is that frightens me. That I'm not a cold calling kind of person.
Yeah, it's a particular skill.
It is a real skill, and you can see it within him. He's beautifully bubbly, wonderfully engaged, and he can make you feel warm very quickly. And he gets gratification when he makes a sale. So he gets that reward, not only in the way that it makes him feel, but he also gets a financial reward from it as well. That's generally what a sales job is, I think.
Yeah.
And he turned around to his colleague the other day who had gotten a sale, and he gave them a high five and he said, "Great job, let's continue this. We need more of this within the office." And he was shut down. The line manager that was in the office on that day told him to focus on his own job, not to concern himself with someone else's wins or someone else's gains or someone else's gratification. But in that moment, my patient felt gratification from his work colleague. I thought that was a really beautiful experience. In a field of beige, which is what I imagine his workplace to be, my abstract memory, my
projection.
Yeah, it is very much. They might have a colour scheme in there. But yeah, that would be more of an idea or an example, perhaps, of gratification.
So this important moment and a reward-based system feels great for a few hours, financially could feel great for some time. Interesting culture where that wasn't afforded as a shared experience. And yet underlying that could be either long-term satisfaction or disillusionment.
I think he wants to know. I know he wants to leave his job. He doesn't want to be there anymore, but he keeps on going back. He shows up every day because of the gratification that he gets of these bonuses and the fact he gets a sale, and it makes him feel very different.
It's interesting, isn't it, that we can almost be anesthetized to the long-term pain or the dissatisfaction of a long-term career. By long-term, I'm talking perhaps 3 to 5 years. I think it's very difficult to think of any career that may be longer than that. The whole notion of careers has been completely dismantled in the last 2 decades. But if we say that a career might be, or a position in one company might be 3 to 5 years, there are shorter tenures, I'm sure. But we can sometimes put up with an awful lot of long-term pain for this short-term dopamine gain, right? Yeah. So I can understand that. A nice comment, a slap on the back, achieving a milestone can be an anesthetic to this long-term malaise. You
can hear it every day. And so we've had a couple of sessions so far. I wonder how long he'll stay there. I wonder how much that lure, the carrot of getting that cash bonus is enough to keep him there.
It is not dissimilar to any other way of stimulating dopamine, that over time you're going to build up a tolerance to it. Now, the first £1,000 check for a placement, if you're in, say, recruitment, must feel wonderful. The second one probably feels wonderful. There's diminishing marginal returns, and either you're going to have to increase that bonus potential to make the dosage higher, or you'll change the frequency, or you'll just become sort of at a point where you realize that you're actually in a long-term malaise and that you can't distract yourself with this sort of like constant dopamine cycle.
Is that something you know personally? Because you worked in recruitment as well, didn't you?
I've never worked in recruitment.
Oh, have you not?
I've worked with recruiters and I've recruited a lot of people. And because my wife has been in recruitment herself, but also related to recruitment and the recruitment industry, I know an awful lot about it. And I've both coached and mentored people in the industry. So I understand that it is quite typical for people after a short career, let's say in that case, maybe 10 years, to no longer feel as much satisfaction potential because they've accumulated sometimes sufficient wealth and they're no longer stimulated by the dopamine hit of the £10,000 payout on a placement. That's not always true, but I think there does come a point where that begins to plateau out and people begin to ask the question, what is the point? I think once we reach a threshold, I think people suggest that it's at somewhere between £60,000 and £100,000 a year. Now, I appreciate that's a substantial amount of money. We have this polarization of incomes where there are far fewer people earning the super bucks and a lot more people who are not earning enough. But nevertheless, there becomes a sort of a satisfaction point at about 60 to 80,000, whatever the number might be, where the incremental increase delivers a diminishing return in overall satisfaction. We pitch out. We probably have somewhere to live. We probably eat reasonably well. I don't necessarily mean that's good, nutritional food, but it might be that it's plentiful. We probably have a car. We probably take 2 or 3 holidays. We plateau out. Now, we can change the quality of any one of those things, but generally, there's only so many watches you can wear at the same time, although I seem to have 2 on. I've only got 2 arms, so it's going to get limited at some point. There's only so many cars. I know there are people who go beyond the plateau, but it's a general point. So I think that what may happen in those types of very dopamine-stimulated jobs, that people begin to either burn out, because there are cultures like the one you've just described, where a manager will say to 2 people, I'm sorry, but you can't share a moment of joy. That's fucking ridiculous. And secondly, that people get to a point of overall satisfaction that means, oh no, not even satisfaction. There is a fulfilment that has happened and an objective that has been achieved. And the satisfaction versus gratification ratio begins to collapse.
I wonder at the moment, given the current climate where people are being pushed an awful lot more, things have become so much more expensive, how volatile that sense of satisfaction is at that same price point. I don't know this, but it's just something that was popping into my head. We're being pushed into a ceiling at the moment where they've kept the tax brackets at exactly the same, and yet they're pushing up the cost of living. So we're hitting a ceiling. And I wonder whether that sense of satisfaction from being within a certain price bracket, a certain wage bracket, is now being challenged an awful lot more than perhaps it would have been 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, potentially. But there are also intrinsic values that will motivate long-term satisfaction. So if we're in a mission-driven business with a very clear declaration of its purpose and what it wishes to achieve, and that you can see that there are some milestones being achieved, then you can take a quite long-range view of your overall pleasure and meaning within a business. If you cannot see that, then I think you switch to gratification. Have I enjoyed the day? Have I enjoyed the week? Have I enjoyed the month? And even if you have to balance the two, sometimes you'll take less gratification because you believe in the long-term satisfaction and still believe that the long-term ambition is achievable. I think this is when people are intrinsically motivated, not extrinsically motivated, not motivated by money, but perhaps by purpose and outcome.
Yeah, very much. That feels like an investment more, doesn't it? I can see the long-term goal here or a project. It might be within a sense of community. It might be supporting people. I'll give an example about how my job makes me feel very shortly around satisfaction and gratification. I think there might be other wonderful projects that are out there that people's sense of satisfaction is going to be unique for every single person, isn't it? My sense of satisfaction, we might have similar senses of satisfaction within our jobs and what we're looking to achieve, but there'll be unique, personalized senses of satisfaction along that path as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that brings us to this point in, or potentially a point in midlife, where one of two questions arise. The first is this it? And I think sometimes that follows a degree of accomplishment. Once you have those kind of building blocks of Maslow's hierarchy in place, you have somewhere to sleep, you have food, and you have possibly family relationships and responsibilities or networks of friends, and there's been some career accomplishment. One might then question, is that it? Or you're able to reframe, what do I value? So there might be that you're stuck in a rut, that you've been through the motions, and the short-term gratification no longer creates long-term accomplishment or fulfillment. Or you have been fulfilled, and yet you wonder what else is possible, where we might move from what we're accumulating. And our job, philosophically, is to gain things and to gather things. Then we move into benevolence, which is, okay, well, what else could I be doing for a wider community than simply my family or even simply myself? And what is my role in a bigger community picture than perhaps the one that I've been conditioned by or living within for the last 20 years? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. Do you want to give us some examples there about perhaps being conditioned and what that bigger picture might look like?
Sure. I went through a similar experience in my career. Came out of the gates, mucked about in my 20s doing various different things, mostly paid. I guess experimental jobs, some of it in catering, some of it in hospitality, some of it in photography. I was finding my way. And it wasn't until I think about 24, 25 that I took what might be considered a conventional job. And then I went on a stellar rise through the ranks. We talked about this in terms of identity. I went through the ranks quite quickly. So I expected my salary to double every year. And I did that for a few years. And I also changed my job title probably every 12 to 18 months. So I could see a career path. And I knew that I started on £13,500, which when I had no money, that seemed like an awful lot of money. And I can remember my career ambition when I was a kid, when I was 14 or 15, was to earn £25,000. And back in the day, that was an awful lot of money. People could buy houses for that. Now you couldn't buy a picture of a house. But I achieved sort of 13,500 in my first job. And then every year doubled it. So by all external sort of parameters was seen as quite successful. And then went on this sort of 20-year path of accumulation. And that accumulation looked like a house. It looked like a partner. And there were children who I'd love absolutely dearly. So I don't see that as an asset or an accumulation. It was a consequence and a wonderful thing. But then I accumulated Farrell and Ball paint and curtains and Porsches and bikes. It was extremely materialistic. And I'm quite comfortable to say that I was a dick. And I'm not suggesting that other people who do that and care about that are dicks. I just was a bit of a dick. I was a creative director. I wore lots of Prada. I had all the toys. And I was accumulating both a substantial label in terms of identity and the payment for that and everything that came with it, the trappings, including sort of what some people might identify as functional alcoholism. But nevertheless, that was the accumulative phase of my life. In my 40s, it wasn't a midlife crisis, although I think I probably had sort of a couple of versions of that. But in my mid-40s, I got to this point where the question was, what is the meaning of all of this? Is this it? Now, that comes from a position of privilege, Karl, because it's easier to say, well, what is the point of this Audi when you have one? When you realize that the gratification is no longer innate within material items, and that it might be that it is more beneficial to be with a person in a relationship, friend, colleague, or that you are intrinsically motivated rather than extrinsically satisfied. That's the point that I reach, which is like, what is the point? And what might different look like? And what happened as a consequence of that is a multitude of career pivots. So anyone who knows my career knows that I moved quite quickly through developing a shoe company and selling it, going into insurance tech as a marketing professional and pivoting from that, then starting climate tech companies and communities. There's been it's a zigzag in a search for purpose and meaning beyond this extrinsic gratification. Long answer to a short question, Karl.
I know, and I'm going to dig a little bit deeper if I can. That period of time that was rising from your first job at 13.5K, and that you then accumulated over a period of time, was that satisfying?
And this is what I think is interesting about that question. Yes, because I was able to take a 15-year or 10-year view. I could see people that were in the role that might be desirable and be perceived as accomplishment. I was projecting into that. I wanted to be accepted. This speaks an awful lot to my childhood and some of my vulnerabilities and insecurities. I wanted to be in a tribe. I wanted to belong. And I'd been an outsider. My parents divorced when I was 8. I was abused as a child. That made it difficult for me. I have complexity around attachment styles. So there's a lot bundled into that. And then my success and the perception of my success became incredibly valuable to me. And I could see a career in that where I could go, okay, if I work hard from here, I could be the youngest person. I was the youngest board member of the agency that I was in. I was on the board at 31, I think. That's an incredibly young, back in the day, that was a young age to be on a board. These days, people are asking what you've been doing for 10 years and why you weren't there in your 20s. But times have changed. But nevertheless, I could see probably a 15-year projection and the accumulation of signifiers. I joke about the Farrell and Ball paint, but I think if we speak to most 55-year-olds, they know what mouse back is or dragon's breath and how fucking difficult it actually is to work with, and most decorators hate it. But we went through this period of people walking into each other's houses and going, oh, which Farrell and Ball paint is that? As if it matters. So I think that you could see yourself on a projection. I wonder whether it is now possible for a 32-year-old, and I know we're going to talk about this when we talk about AI next week, but can a 32-year-old or a 35-year-old either desire or could see a 15-year career span? I could, but when I got to the end of it, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the first thing that was happening was that I was being given more and more shares to hardwire me into an organization. I'm not going to name the technology company that I work for, but there's only 2 or 3 of this order of magnitude in the world, and it's one of the leading technology companies. And even though I got pay rises, no longer at 100% every year, for sure, that sort of the velocity of that sort of de-accelerated. But what was happening was I was being given an awful lot of stock, and they called us silverbacks. So even though I was 45, what I was getting is a lot of stock in the business and a Range Rover to keep me in the business. This is when experience was a currency. And I just woke up one day and was like, I don't desire any of this. And so I think I got to the point at which I'd had a lot of gratification and satisfaction, but both of them, I challenged both of them. And I don't know that is unusual. And then what we typically say is I'm stuck, or I'm in a rut, or you get into Viktor Frankl's world of man's search for meaning and go, the existential question, like, why am I here? Because it's probably not to select Farrell and Ball paint.
I reckon there must be a lot of satisfaction in being part of the creative team of Farrell and Ball paint and being able to come up with new types of names for the paints.
I think it'd be a great job.
I think it would be an amazing job.
Because you've only got to do probably 5 names a year. So you could do one every 2 months, or you could just do it all in 1 month and have most of the rest of the time to go kite surfing. Yeah, we're in.
For that. Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can hear gratification, I can hear satisfaction in both of those elements within that career trajectory, and what you said there as well. There is projection, but there's also short-term, and I would imagine short-term gains and short-term goals and short-term rewards. I would imagine that both of those would have fed back into one another over a period of time as well.
Yeah.
But you said they peaked. They hit definitely a pinnacle. You couldn't see this because we're not putting out the video of this, but you gave the impression of going over a hill of something, and something changed.
And I would say that I don't mean to be pejorative of that period of time. The thing that I've learned is that almost anyone aged between 25 and 50 goes through this cumulative phase. And the outliers are the people who reject those paths, right? The oddballs that we see on the internet, and I love them, who might do van life or might pursue a completely different way of reframing what a career is or what a use of time is, forget even the notion of career, are the outliers. On a bell curve, they're a very small percentage of the whole. And I think we sometimes, or I might even have looked at those people and wished that I could have similarly been driven by alternative motivations. But I don't regret either that passage of time. First of all, I have 2 incredible daughters. I had lots of wonderfully gratifying experiences and also some long-term satisfaction. There are still people who talk very fondly about the times that we may have worked together and some of the things that we accomplished. So I'm not suggesting that it's any more or less valuable than what happened when I got to the point at which I questioned. I think that is just part of the human condition. It's one of the ages of man, and I'd use that term to include all genders, that we just question what is the point. For some, it's a continuation of the same. The whole point is to accumulate wealth and material items, and if that is somebody's path, then that's absolutely fine. But for many, it's a question of what is satisfaction in the second half of my life, and also what will I use to get gratification. There's nothing wrong with gratification. Yeah. Everybody loves it.
Yeah.
But what am I using as tools to achieve it?
I guarantee every person, you and I, everyone listening to this podcast, and perhaps the remaining couple of hundred people left in the world that aren't listening to this podcast yet, go through stages of gratification every single day. Mm-hmm. It's part of the human experience. We can't not.
Tell me about your own motivate. Sorry, I cut across you there, but go on.
I saw a very black and white, very simplified graphic this morning on a social media platform, and it was pretty sobering. And there was a moment of kind of reality check there, and it was first 20 years of life, education, learning. Mm-hmm. It wasn't linear. It was very. Then the next block was 50 years work. Then it had a less than 10 number of years, and then die. And that was it. If we really strip it back, what is there beyond, for most people and most models that most people are forced into through a number of different mechanisms, but that is probably a good summarization of most people's existence in the Western capitalist world.
Absolutely. There's a person who ran a creative agency whose name I forget, but we'll put it in the show notes. And he saw that very same infographic, or a version of it, this period of dense work-related activity, and then a very short period of time that's retirement. And we know that some people retire and then catastrophize, and as a consequence die inadvertently, prematurely, because their purpose and meaning has just simply evaporated. So what he did with his agency, even though it was incredibly successful, is he closed it down every 7 years. He would shut the agency down for everybody, and they would have a sabbatical year.
Oh, it wasn't just no more jobs, sack you off, you on the street.
They knew they would come back a year later. But basically what he did, and he's got a brilliant infographic of this, he took the sort of 7 or 8 years that people might have post-retirement, this is pretty gloomy, and to the point at which they died. And he said, I'm going to take the years and distribute them across the timeline back from 25 onwards. And then every 7 years, he basically shut his company down and said, we're all taking a year off to learn things, to experience things, to do fuck all if that's what we want to do. And then we'll come back together cumulatively richer because we haven't had to follow this path. I wonder how that long-term satisfaction would have been reframed within that team, because there would have been gratification, but you also kind of know that you're going to go through 2 or 3 phases, and then you're going to have a sabbatical year. I often wonder what would happen if you were bursting in 3-year phases in companies. Would you change the way that you perform and the way that you behave if that was the character of your business?
Yeah, it reminds me, so I used to go and do wellness packages within a range of different corporate companies, from big global international accountancies to, let's use the example of one, creative agencies in and around a certain small area of London. And this one particular creative agency, after you'd done 2 years there, you would get a 3-month sabbatical. Everyone was offered this. You'd get the first 6 weeks, no, the first month at full pay, second month at half pay, and the third month you wouldn't get paid for. You didn't have to take those 3 months, but you were given an opportunity to go and do, and you could do whatever you wanted. You were not accountable for that time. And everyone who worked at that company, there was just a different feel to it, particularly compared to the big corporate accountancy company I'd go and do wellness programs for. It felt really different. I get the whole ethos of the business is going to be different in those 2 domains, but people generally hung around for a lot longer. They would go off and they'd go and do wonderful things. You're being paid to go and take time out and go and travel somewhere. Yeah. That felt really, at that time, which would have been 20 years ago, that felt quite... I don't think they do this anymore, by the way, probably because they can't afford to do, which is also a sign of the times. But it felt really fresh, really invigorating. And I could see, not that I wanted to, but I could see why people wanted to work in a company like that.
Yeah, I can understand that. Google famously used to have Fridays where you could do your own experiments and your own work. I think they no longer do that either. I think that might have been diminished to 10%. If it happens at all. I'm probably one of the only people in the world who hasn't or doesn't work at Google, although arguably we all are little batteries inside Google. But I can understand when it was conceived, that would have been incredibly motivating, that then there were shared values, but also that we could have both gratification and satisfaction from complementary sort of side projects and gigs, with a kind of a question mark around what happens with intellectual property within those types of cultures. But there were lots of creative companies who were experimenting with sort of the whole notion of work-life balance. It is definitely true, though, isn't it, that people can get to a point where the short-term gratification is no longer enough to satisfy us in the long term.
Yeah, I do feel that there is an expiry date on that. I don't know that personally. I don't think I've been in a job that has been rewarded in that same sense of gratification in the same way a sales job might be. That's not been my career path at all, but I would imagine that there is an element of maybe even burnout that comes from that. The risk and reward, the drive and the decay that might come from that, and perhaps decay is too strong a word there, but the decline might be a better, more balanced word. If you are pushing that hard and you get those level of rewards at that rate, at some point something's going to shift, probably. Certainly within the patient cohort that I see, I work with lots of bankers, investors, hedge fund managers. Another is youngish, late 20s. We spoke about his lifestyle at the moment and how he's up at 5 o'clock. He gets the train at 5:40 into London. He gets back home from work at 8 o'clock, but he's still working. And he's very much aware of the impact that his life is having over his symptoms. He sits for extraordinarily long periods of time. He invests in the Middle East and the Middle East stock markets. We are May 2026 at the moment, the middle of May 2026. And earlier this year, his symptoms really ramped up. Change in stock markets, change in demand, change in pressure on him. He gets great bonuses. He has a great reward from his work. But he was speaking about golden handcuffs.
Yeah, for sure.
So the benefit of the financial gains and the financial reward from his job, and he says he sees it in people much older than him, these are his words, in their 40s and 50s in the stock markets and banking world. And he says they have accumulated a particular lifestyle, which means they must now continue working their job, and they are bound by the income they've had, and therefore they are now imprisoned or handcuffed to their lifestyle. So they have to sustain it, because if they don't, They won't have their wine cellars that they're used to, that second or third home somewhere, the private schools for their kids. And I'm being very generalized here as well. But I thought that was quite insightful for a relatively young man, for me anyway, 28 years old. He was willing to forego that for long-term satisfaction and also his health and well-being.
And a lot of people have probably followed that path. It's not to say that the rut that then people might find themselves is a desperately ugly, horrible rut. It could be fine wines and fast cars and nice holidays and private school education. But what we value may be shifting. There comes a point where the discomfort generated by the lack of second era satisfaction, when you can't project much further, then perhaps there's a discomfort that comes, even though the circumstances are seemingly quite pleasant. That was certainly my experience. Let's ask the question. So if and when somebody comes to this inflection point where they ask, what is the meaning? Is there something beyond this? How might they, it's a huge question, but just thoughts about, in your conversations with people and your own experience, how might people find an answer to the question?
I think looking at one's own needs, and we covered this in self-care it's slightly abstract from this, but we looked at someone's needs. I do wonder, and I see this within the people that I work with, I know that you'll be able to give a nod to this yourself, but at a certain point in our lifetime, our health starts to change. Or we maybe start to lose people in our life, or perhaps children reach an age of not having to depend on us financially in the way that they have done beforehand. We're not having to support them through education or schooling or something else. Or maybe they've moved out. So we don't need as many rooms. Perhaps there are existential questions made over our well-being or what that might look like. Maybe we go through procedures, or we know people around us that start to go through life-changing experiences as well. And it starts to, I think there is a point where we start to realize I'm not immortal. I am fallible here. And I think something inevitable starts to shift. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden we can go, oh, fuck it, I'm going to change my career and do something completely different. But maybe our compass starts to change a little bit. Maybe there is an awareness for many of us midlife men that we start to go, I wonder why am I doing what I'm doing? What is the purpose behind this? Am I at the edge of burnout? Am I dragging myself into work? Am I having other health problems? Am I asking myself really big questions because a parent or parents have died and I don't have? That makes me realize that there is a guillotine moment in my life where there is nothing beyond that as well. My dad went through life. He came from a very poor Irish background, west coast of Ireland, came from nothing. He came over here when he was 21 and got a job working for British Rail. And he worked his way through as a ticket collector. He then got himself a job in a bank. And at 23, 24, he decided that he was going to nestle into the bank with no qualifications, and you could do this in the late 60s, early 70s, nestle into a bank and start to work his way up. So his projection was, I am going to gain financial, I'm going to say comfort, but actually it didn't turn out to be very comfortable for him. He became so obsessed with not spending money and accumulating a comfortable platform for him, but actually that in itself became a golden handcuff, a noose around his ankle. And so it got to the point where he was so, and it's quite an extreme example, but so stringent with his money, he wouldn't buy himself a new pair of shoes in fear of losing the assets that he couldn't hold. I can't remember that. It was one of the Disney films or cartoons, and it was about a Donald Duck character that would dive into his basement, or he would dive into a pot of money and he would be swimming.
Yeah, I remember. There were the three little ones.
Yeah, that's
and then
right.
him and
Huey, Louie, and Dewey.
Yeah, and I can't remember what he was like the grumpy sort of uncle or whatever with pots of cash. I remember the cartoon.
Yeah, if you know the answer, please message
please
us with the answer. That one, ouch. But secondly, my dad had nothing. He wasn't holding on to. He wasn't able to count this. It was all digital numbers, binary zeros and ones in a bank account. But it made him feel somewhere deep down quite secure. even though he had all kinds of other insecurities, chronic PTSD, chronic grief. That for him was something that he was able to, and this is the irony, hold on to and give him a sense of purpose or satisfaction, even though in the latter part of his life, that was not who he was.
And also, it's so fragile, isn't it? We think that this is a solid foundation of rock, and we see the delicacy of the markets and how fragile and fickle they are. And we might rush to material stocks like gold and platinum, or we might try to move our money into new forms of cash such as Bitcoin, or we might all chase the tech stocks, whatever it might be, but it's all incredibly fragile and it can disappear in a moment. When we realize that it's quite ephemeral, and yet we desperately try to hold on to it because there's something reassuring about the accumulation of wealth. Maybe it is that we get to a point in our lives where we realize that the most important currency we have is time and not necessarily money. There are very few people, though, Karl, I think, that then take the leap. It is quite hard, I think, to get out of that muscle memory and the culture of work. It's particularly difficult, I think, to create escape velocity. I work with a lot of men to help them envision what their highest dream could be. And it is rarely the job that they're in. It is very often not even adjacent, but often completely different. We all know people who've worked in corporate industries and are now carpenters. We may not all know them, but I know that you and I definitely know them. But I've seen few people manifest after the leap and turn that into a practical reality. I can always think of one client that I worked with who got to this point at which the satisfaction was no longer sufficient. And the dopamine hits, even though he was really successful, no longer touched the sides. And he got to this disconsolate point, which was to go, there must be something else. And then he could conceive of what something else was, but it was entirely different from his current circumstances. And so he reframed everything. I've never seen anyone ever do it since, but not because it's impossible, but just because this took so much courage that he reframed all of his finances. He completely changed his relationship with debt, particularly in and around mortgages. He had all of the trappings and reduced everything to requiring little, and then decided to follow a career as an educationalist. So left one career path and started on another. Obviously had to think about the impact of that for others, including his family. But I think from start to finish, that process took him 6 months. And then he manifested a completely alternative path, one that was embedded in a reframed sense of meaning. Quite remarkable. And then there's shades of similar stories in many of the case studies and the client relationships that I've had. But at a pinnacle, I'm not suggesting that is right for everybody, but first to be able to anticipate through a value system what an alternative lifestyle could be, and then to execute it. Quite remarkable.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. In 6 months, like that decision process and the time, you mentioned time as a commodity. I think there's something else I'd like to touch on in just a moment as well. But that ability within 6 months to completely pivot, that's a nuts-in decision as well, isn't it?
Totally, all in.
So time is one element. I think there is that awareness of perhaps something slipping away from us, that we maybe have... What is it? Over the Hill at 40 was a mug I remember my dad was given at his 40th birthday. But health. Health is a currency that, it's an investment, I should say. Let's look at it in a slightly different way. Health is perhaps the best, if we can invest in our health and well-being, it is perhaps the best return that we're likely to get. It's not guaranteed. You might change your lifestyle around, you might start to invest in your health and well-being, and still you might end up with health and well-being issues.
Of course.
But it's something that gives a greater return on that nothing else will ever be able to give you in that same sense.
Quality of life.
That quality of life. Again, another patient of mine, he works restoring heritage boilers up and down the country. And he knew of a friend of the family that lived in a neighboring farm, and this guy was wealthy beyond your dreams. But in his late 60s, from a health point of view, he was fucked. he could not enjoy any more of the accumulation that he had made. And my patient looked at him and said, I cannot end up like him. I love the work. I love the freedom that the money gives to me. But at a certain point, there is a payoff. Yeah. There is something that starts to switch. And I think it's very often the case that there is a bigger question that starts to come from this: gratification versus satisfaction.
Yep, and that may be the trigger that means that people question what they're going to do with their time as a vocation, their time at work. I can relate to this. By the time we publish this podcast, it'll probably become increasingly apparent that I'm spending more time in the clearing than I do in other endeavors, although they will complement this as a focus. Because one gets to the point where you reframe your values and what is most important. And health span is definitely one of those things. Having been through and still in Sniper's Alley and had a couple of reasonably significant shots, it's a metaphor, with colon resectioning and hemorrhoids and fissures and various other reasons. I've been under general anaesthetic 4 or 5 times in the last 2 or 3 years. The thing I value quite highly now is the days where I feel healthy. There's that sort of adage, health is wealth, but it's definitely true. And particularly because it affords me time to do the things which are most gratifying, to bring it back to gratification. And that is time with my family. That is time with my friends. That is time on a skateboard. It is about doing work that's important, and to help another person is, for me now, the most gratifying thing that I can do, and long-term satisfying. That there is an opportunity to create conversations between men. Really important, and I think increasingly important. So that is what I now choose to do with my time. I think that I have developed the muscle that lets me leap. I've done it several times. My wife is very comfortable and familiar with this cycle of, okay, I'm going to do something different. I'm not inhibited by my age nor expectations of others. I don't give a fuck about Farrell and Ball paint. I value those things less. I appreciate it in other people's homes, but care less about it in my own. That's why my house is painted in white. God knows what they would call this in that brainstorm. Wispy white or Snow White. These names have probably gone. We'll do a whole podcast on names that we could call white.
Yeah.
But I think I've developed that muscle that says if you're not satisfied, don't do it. I know that's something that not everyone can afford, apart from our friend who literally said, okay, affordability is the first question I've got to answer. And so he rewrote his relationship with money, which is remarkable.
It's incredibly sobering. Can you explain to us Sniper's Alley? We did a men's circle the other day, and you used this phrase then as well. I want to just draw the light over it. We went to the theatre yesterday to watch Matilda. Tim Minchin's. If you haven't seen it, brilliant production. Incredible lighting as one of the things in there. Cast a spotlight over Sniper's Alley for us for just a moment, because there's so much richness here.
Yeah, well, there's going to be edge cases, right? So my best friend died when he was 43. He had a massive heart attack and possibly wasn't that aware of his passing. But he was doing something that he loved. He was on a push bike at the time. Push bike, that's an ancient phrase. He was on a racing bike. But I don't think that it wasn't a cardiac event because of the cycling. Yeah. It just happened to be coincidentally where that happened. So he passed, one might say, before his prime or before his time. And people use that expression. I don't know how much time we're meant to get given, but when people die young, people think that seems to be unfair or certainly tragic. However, let's assume an average lifespan of 75 to 80 years, men seemingly a little less than women, but let's say, I think the actual average now is something like 73. So we have this 73-year lifespan. There's a health span within that. And so we might live longer, but will we be healthy enough to be in sort of a positive mental state, a positive physical state? And then we have this period in midlife where, as a consequence perhaps of our lifestyle up until that point, or simply because statistically these things happen, parts of the body, and we often use mechanistic, systematic terms, but aspects of your well-being, physical or mental well-being, begin to just creak and grind and create a bit of friction. The obvious thing is like our joints. Having walked 20 million steps or whatever it might be that people have accumulated, probably many more than that, and particularly if you're kind of a sporty person, you might have put so much pressure through a particular joint or through your skeletal system that things like the cartilage begins to collapse, and then we get onset arthritis and these types of conditions. So people recognize that. But similarly, the organs begin to fatigue. So I call this period somewhere between 50 and 60 Sniper's Alley. The idea being that someone or something, life, is taking pot shots at you. Now, you might avoid them completely. There are people who transcend that period of time, their midlife, make it to 60, and therefore may, by percentage, go on to have a long life in comparative wellness, because they have not had to face, for example, one of the 5 big killers. Cancer is obviously one of them, but there are 3 or 4 others that are seen as the 5 horses of the apocalypse. And they've avoided, not necessarily avoided, but for whatever reason, gone through that passage of time without falling foul of any one of those 5 or anything else. For others, we have to face those conditions. Now, some of those shots are fatal shots and will kill us. And obviously, between those ages, we're going to experience more death than perhaps we did as children. Generally speaking, as we reach midlife, there's going to be more death, not only in our sort of parental generation, but possibly in our own. And so these are the shots that are fired. Now, arguably, I've been quite lucky. I've taken a couple of rounds. Hemorrhoids and fissures are extremely painful, but not fatal. The colon resectioning could have been fatal, but modern science and a brilliant surgeon saved me from an ill fate. But that's what I mean by this period of time. Now, there's obviously the odds and fate. You can live an incredibly monastic, pure life, eating only non-processed foods and the most nutritional things, and yet still end up with a precondition being manifest. It is also true that you could drink every day, smoke every day, eat utter shit, and fly through this period of time. And there are some OAPs who are chain-smoking alcoholics and yet seemingly make old years in comparatively good health. So there's always edge cases. But we have this period of time, and it might be that we invest in it in order to minimize the risk or to be as strong as possible when the seemingly inevitable happens. I recovered well because I went into my condition strong, whether that's physical or mental strength. But my recovery from the colon resectioning was successful, possibly because I went into it comparatively fit. I don't want to become a health elitist here. It's another ism, isn't it? Where I don't want to project a judgment on other people's health and well-being. But that's what we mean by Sniper's Alley. Typically late 40s, going into early 60s. How will we live our 60th and our 61st year is very dependent upon what we did in the decade that preceded it. So that's the point. Can you relate to any of that?
Yeah, personally, I'm
not necessarily personally because you're not in the time frame, but to the philosophy of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have seen it with people around me, around us, my wife and I, friends, their family members. I've seen it within my patients themselves as well. It's reality. It's right there. We don't have to look too far. We don't like looking at it because it's uncomfortable, and that's why I wanted to give it a bit of a nod today as well. And we will, for a future podcast, talk about our relationship with our health and death as well, inevitably.
Absolutely.
That will be a future podcast. It's really important. I feel that there is a Sniper's Alley for careers and relationships within the workplace itself as well. And next week, we're going to pick this up around AI.
Yeah, for sure.
AI doesn't only influence that particular alleyway that you were just talking around there. It influences, and it is inevitably influencing all ages. Perhaps the older generation, they might decide to not look at AI. Older generation, maybe 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but there will be people that are utilizing it.
For sure.
It's the opportunities that come from it as well. But I think there are plenty of midlife men that are probably feeling a little bit in that sniper's alleyway at the moment around the use of AI and the introduction of AI within the workplace itself.
If you look at the stats for people's employment and their redundancy during their early 50s, one of the biggest influences on that is health. That might be that health has forced them out of work, or at least the same pattern of work. Or it may be that a health revelation, whether it's simply that it's very valuable or that it's under threat, has meant that somebody has taken a different path. The other is this insurgence of technology, where our relationship with it and its impact generally on the workplace is creating a decline of employment in stratas of society. And we'll go into that in much more depth. I think that for myself personally, I look at the long-term satisfaction I get from my health versus the long-term satisfaction I get in my employment. And those things have to be balanced. If they are imbalanced, I change one or the other or both. It's as simple as that.
I would be confident in stating this, that introduction of AI will most definitely have had an impact on, within the workplace, midlifers' sense of gratification, and that might be feeling slightly threatened now. And also midlifers' sense of satisfaction within the workplace as well. It's volatile, sure. Isn't it?
Yeah, because previously, when your father was going through, say, the banking system, one of the currencies of his value, or one of the measures of his value, was experience. Yeah. And yet now, all experience, arguably, or all recorded human knowledge and experience is simply a prompt away. So therefore, that unit of currency has been completely reframed, and it's not beholden to somebody in their 50s to be able to wield it. It can be used by a 21-year-old with practically no preconception and certainly no pre-experience as to the point of the prompt. That changes everything. So yeah, I think we will deep dive into the world of AI, both the opportunity that it represents and the anxiety index, to use the AI acronym, or the anxiety-inducing effect of this technology, not only in midlifers, but across every generational strata.
People have had huge amounts of gratification through the work and the careers that they've had, and huge amounts of satisfaction. They are slightly different. We've unpicked both and given examples from either side there as well. You can have gratification and satisfaction under the same umbrella. One perhaps has a slightly shorter shelf life than the other one. And we're reaching a point that I think this is naturally going to change given the economic and technological climates that are changing at the moment as well.
100%. So let's close out with something. We haven't done this before, and I'm about to throw you not under the bus. Absolutely not. No one needs tire treads across their back. Let's close out with gratification and gratitude. This week, Karl, can you think of for instance, where for good you have experienced a moment of gratification in your work?
Every session I have with my patients is a completely unique and bespoke conversation with them. And sometimes you start a conversation, a session, and you never know where it's going to go. Sometimes it feels like there's a bit of a particular pathway. There are two moments here, so I'm going to give a nod to two moments. One was a patient of mine in Iraq. I've never met him. I don't see ourselves meeting ever. I work with international patients. His life is incredibly limited. The pain that he has in his life at the moment means that he has given up work. He doesn't go outside, doesn't see friends, doesn't see family. His existence is between bedroom, dining room, and living room. It is incredibly small. He doesn't speak with anyone other than his wife. No family members. We've been exchanging emails this week and voice notes. There's huge amounts of gratification for, and he stated this himself, for being seen and being heard. From my end, that acknowledgement that I have opened up someone's life, even a fraction, pulled the curtains open just a tiny little amount, shone a light, that gratification of hearing and seeing someone and being asked to be part of that process is just absolutely gold. The second example, very different. So that guy's in his 50s. Second example is a patient I worked with yesterday in his mid-20s, very different conversation. And the first place we took it to was spirituality. And what is the meaning of life? And is all of this real? Is any of it real? Should I just give up and not do anything at all? And we were speaking about purpose, and we were speaking about courage, and we were speaking about the offers that are on the table. He's trying to find himself at 28 years old. He's had to go through a process of forgetting or becoming so disillusioned within the world about himself and what that means. And I'm starting to give him permission to go, well, if that resonates with you, if that makes you feel good, it doesn't matter what it is to the rest of the world. But if that makes you feel good, fishing, photography, dancing, whatever it is, that's what you should start to orbit around, because that's going to start to give you meaning and purpose in your life.
Permission.
What about you? Gratitude in this week for work?
It depends on the framework we're using for work. What I will talk about is the gathering that we had on Wednesday evening. So we do these meetings of men under the condition of Chatham House rules, where what we talk about isn't shared and we don't bring it into this podcast. We might talk about themes, but we're not going to be specific, and we're certainly not going to personalize anything that's talked about in those environments. And they're magical, because to be heard and to realize that there are common themes, even though each of us is unique, is an incredibly powerful environment. I'm incredibly grateful this week that a young man walked into that environment and expressed his utter vulnerability in doing just that, and yet spoke so eloquently about what motivates him and what he wants to try to achieve, and instantaneously connected with people who could mentor him, encourage him, and bring other resources to his idea such that he can manifest it. There's a serendipity to that is beautiful, that he was in the right place at the right time. He probably will do that because he's just increasing the odds of an opportune collision. There's a story about the design of Apple and why the toilets were put in the middle of the building. And Jobs would have talked about the fact that he orchestrated accidental collisions between people who may not have met one another if all of the departments were sort of segregated and that the bathrooms were out on the edges of the buildings, because all the people in finance would have used the toilets closest to finance. But if all of them were in the middle of the building, you might get serendipitous conversations between someone in finance and someone in creative. And I'm sure that young man would have had as beneficial conversations because he's just simply increasing the odds. But being able to hold space such that he was able to step into it, into the clearing, and to be vulnerable and to put himself out of his comfort zone and to be seemingly so rewarded in the moment was a moment that I'm incredibly grateful to have experienced. Maybe that is both gratifying and, in the long term, satisfying, Karl.
Let's hope so. Steve Jobs making people do jobs in the middle of the building.
There you go, jobs for jobs. I'll see you in the clearing next week.
AI.
Anxiety inducing.
So where can people reach out and find us, Matt?
Please subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for listening today. It's brilliant if you just click subscribe. We can then tell you when we've launched another podcast. Secondly, you can come to our website. There's lots of interesting stuff there, events that we do, content that we write, information about the podcast, where you can meet us. So please come there and subscribe. We promise not to spam you. If LinkedIn's your thing, then both Karl and I have LinkedIn pages and the clearing is there. And finally, if you'd like more visual content like Reels, then you can see us on Instagram. If you'd like to email us, email matt@theclearing.life. Same URL as the website, matt@theclearing.life, and we promise to try to answer.
I'll put all the links to all of what we've just mentioned beneath the description of this podcast.
We'll see you in the clearing.